So continuing on this theme about what questions you can ask at local housing committees or full council meetings, and just talking about some of the good questions we've seen work really well in Bedford and what impact they had. Another really important question that we asked, and this is maybe going back 2 or 3 years now, in Bedford, we asked Bedford the question, in fact we did an FOI first, I think, if I remember correctly. So we did an FOI, we basically said, what is the average caseload of housing officers since just before the Homelessness Reduction Act came in? So I think we asked for details on like March 2018, so just before it came in. And then in 2020 maybe, and then like 2 years down the line as well, so 2022, something like that. I can't remember the exact dates. But basically, the answer was, in the FOI, it went up from something like 20 to 25, right up to 55 to 60. And that was in the same time that the duties on housing officers through the HRA massively multiplied. So actually, their job was now much more difficult. So caseloads had tripled and the workload had maybe doubled, in terms of all the relief duty, all that sort of stuff. And so we just took those stats to the housing committee and said, effectively, is there anything you guys can do? And immediately, a Conservative councillor who sadly passed away now, Councillor Steve Moon, you could see him immediately kind of pick up on this question. You'll see that sometimes, sometimes councillors can see something in your question which is important to them, and kind of they can see that it's going to lead to some improvement. So essentially that led to then a bit of a debate between the different council parties at the time. Everything went quiet for a little bit, maybe 6 months or so. But shortly afterwards, the Bedford Borough Council then announced that they had secured funding for an additional, I think, 22 housing officers or housing staff across different kind of sub-teams. And that, and they've now basically now committed to try and keep, I don't know how firm the commitment is, but they're going to try and keep caseloads down to 40. Now, I don't know if 40 is manageable for duties under the HRA, but it's certainly better than 60. And it was going up as well. So that's another good example of where just asking a decent informed question, and essentially that came out of the fact that clearly we could see housing officers were struggling with their capacity, so we weren't getting responses. We were getting kind of late decisions, all that sort of thing, which led us to make the FOI, which led us to the question of the housing committee, which led there to be 22 new housing officers which have been recruited this year. So another good one. We actually did some FOIs around the country on this one, and effectively caseloads across the 15 districts that we FOI'd nearly doubled. The worst council I saw was Milton Keynes, which reported having caseloads of 177. But there was a kind of, which is extreme, but there was this kind of overall sort of increase in the resources. And again, making the point that the HRA has brought in all these additional duties. So that's a good question to kind of focus in on with your local council, and actually one which the housing officers were really grateful for, because we kind of get told privately that they appreciate that we'd asked that question and raised that issue, because for whatever reason they didn't feel able to do it themselves. So there's that question there that you just wanted just to throw in. And again, it's something that you're not just asking the question once, you're looking at that theme of housing officer capacity. It then ties into the training, which I mentioned in the last video. So you can start building up this idea of how do we ask questions from the outside to make that housing team properly resourced, both in terms of numbers and also training and expertise. So real nice, easy question. Another question you can ask is around the number of families with children or pregnant women in B&Bs for more than 6 weeks. Now, again, this is a number which you can see on the government's homelessness live tables. And Birmingham, I think at the moment, has got the record. Most recent stats I saw, they had something like 600 families in B&Bs with children, and something like 400 of which were over the 6-week limit. And in last week's LGO newsletter that got sent out, I saw 3 different upheld complaints with the LGO for Birmingham, all 3 of which resulted in thousands of pounds worth of compensation. So you can ask that effort, or you can FOI, or you can ask it in the housing committee to get them all thinking about it. Once you've got that number, and I would advise asking a question in the housing committee rather than just going online to get the stats, because again, it becomes public record. You're then getting the councillors to actually say it out loud, which is important, because once you've then got them to do that, you can then start educating them about the fact that there is hundreds of pounds worth of compensation per month that the person would then be eligible for if they complain. So the LGO currently recommends that families who are over that 6-week limit with children, they get between £100 and £200 per week, per additional week they're in over that limit. So that can very quickly, spiral into thousands of pounds. That's something councillors need to know about. They need to know what is the council doing about it. And again, sometimes you're just feeding bits of information into that debate and they can go and debate it themselves. You're not having to have that argument with different housing officers or whatever. You're just getting the councillors themselves, whose job is in part to hold the council to account, to give the kind of information they need to go and look to get improvements. So again, it's a nice little easy one I recommend. Third question for this video. Which one should we do? So again, going back to that kind of overall picture of what I believe needs to happen to end homelessness. So building more houses, bringing empty homes back online. But another one around housing stock is going to be, how do you deal with rogue landlords? How do you improve the quality of private rented accommodation? Because every area's got rogue landlords for sure. I'm sure if you work in an area, you'll probably know the names of several. I certainly do in Bedford. But there's a whole range of questions you can ask about this issue. So previously we've asked the council how many, I think the question was, does the council have a register of rogue landlords, which it has to do? And if so, the answer was yes. How many landlords are currently on that register? And the answer was 0. So again, that flags it as an issue. The councillors who are sitting there watching that happen will know of stories of constituents coming to them and very clearly rogue landlords operating in their area, and yet the council's saying we don't have anyone on the register. So that flags it as an issue. You can then use that theme to kind of build on it, and maybe the next question for the next committee is going to be, what steps can the council take to take action against rogue landlords? And councils do have a number of powers. When I worked in Bedford Borough Council 10 years ago or so, they specifically didn't want to challenge those rogue landlords because they needed those properties to put people into. So even though they shouldn't be using rogue landlords for discharges of homelessness duties, they still will be, particularly the kind of so-called informal offers you get in the relief duty. So, as I say, again, you're just you're looking to set the council's agenda to focus on that issue, because if you're not asking those questions, no one else will be, in my experience. So you can kind of build that picture up. That can then lead to further opportunities when you can kind of bring people in who have photos and videos of really kind of slummy type properties, which again, pictures speak 1,000 words. That's a really good way to kind of get the council's attention. And then it also dovetails with the idea of damp and mould. So Bedford, one of the councillors who's the CAB manager in another area, Councillor Dean Crofts, who's quality, he's been continually raising the issue about damp and mould, particularly around children, how it affects their breathing. And we're going to see that become a bit of an issue because after Awar Bishak's death 3 years ago now, there's obviously been a lot more attention. There's legislation coming in that's going to tie in with the ending of Section 21s, which is going to do something around the powers, which I assume councils will have to take action against landlords. So again, it's going to be a bit of a live issue and one you want to be raising in this kind of forum to get them thinking about these kind of issues. I can't remember how many you've done. I think that's the third one. Let's do a fourth one. So another big one of those kind of big strands of how you end homelessness is you make sure that the council is actively genuinely involving people who've used homelessness services, particularly their homelessness service, to inform how they respond to homelessness, how they deliver services. One of the fancy words for it is co-production. Lived experience is another term you see bandied around as well. There's actually money available for councils in certain funding streams if they are co-produced. So there's actually some financial incentives to have a co-produced kind of homelessness service in a council. In my experience, there can be a lot of resistance to that idea because, in my opinion, some senior council officers just believe that all homeless people are scum and they've got nothing to offer, basically, nothing really more than that in some cases, which obviously isn't true. The danger with co-production is it's done badly. And so a good example of that, I'll actually use the Housing Committee in Bedford as an example. A guy who was living in supported accommodation, who basically asked the question, who holds the supported accommodation providers to account? And he did it anonymously, although the council still managed to spill out who it was. So well done, council, on that one. Or certainly, kind of give a clue who it might be. And the chair of the committee, who I think is well-intentioned, basically said, I'd really be interested to hear about complaints people have about supported accommodation. But what I think she doesn't really understand is people will lose their accommodation if they raise issues. That's the reality. People are very, very scared, and understandably so, that if they raise issues about their supported accommodation provider, they will find themselves on the persona non grata kind of list, and they'll find, they'll kind of start getting warnings for little things that don't matter, and before you know it, they've been evicted. So there's that kind of, I think in Bedford, we don't want them to just kind of do some tick box exercise in co-production. We want them to see genuine, involvement with people who've been homeless. And there's some great people around in Bedford who've been homeless, who've got very sensible things to say. And we're just asking lots of questions around how the council's pursuing that stuff. Because if you just leave it to them, they'll just do some tokenistic nonsense that doesn't help anyone and actually screws people over as well. As I say, it's not just about kind of getting them into trouble, but just disrespects them and kind of demeans them to a great extent. So that whole kind of process of genuinely co-producing people who've been homeless is not just something you can kind of just do out thin air. the staff need to get training on how to do it properly without harming the people they're supposed to be helping out. So that's a really important issue. Again, Bedford, we kind of asked a number of questions about that, and there's they make noises about being committed to it, but we're not seeing anything yet. They put some stuff in writing, but it doesn't seem to work. I think kind of going off on a slight tangent, but still talking about lived experience. So we've been banging on about the council having a domestic abuse policy for 12 years now, because since 2012 there has been a duty to have a robust domestic abuse policy as part of their legal duties, and Bedford hasn't had one, and has screwed over many people who've been fleeing domestic abuse or affected by domestic abuse over the years. Really horrendous cases, and yet to date they still haven't published one. And the most recent noise is that they're going to do one. We asked the question, are you going to make sure it's co-produced? And they're saying it is, but what I think is actually they're probably going to be doing is having staff involved who've been subject to domestic abuse, which is a good move. But you need people who've been through the service, not just people who've been affected by domestic abuse, but you need to have people who've been through the homelessness services, because they're the ones who know what really happens on the ground. So there's, as I say, co-production's a work in progress in Bedford, but it's a really important strand to be looking at, because it can change the whole culture of, probably more than anything, it can change the culture of a team. It's very difficult to change the culture of a team when you've got some dinosaurs in the team who are just wrong-uns. Very difficult to do anything about that. But by doing co-production properly, I would say you can actually kind of win people towards that model, rather than it just being a stick to tell people to tick a box or something. So this one's a really important one, actually. So it was based on a number of different things. So this was based on a client I worked with 4 years ago now, I can't remember. But basically I went to meet her. She lived with her mum and a grandma in a 2-bed flat up a high rise, and the grandma had had a very serious stroke, was now bedbound, I don't know if that's the right word for it, but basically wasn't able to leave bed. The unsuitability of their property meant she wasn't able to do any rehab at all. She wasn't able to do stairs, so if there's a fire she ain't getting out because the lifts don't work or whatever. And I just felt really powerless about this, because I was like, there's clearly a legal duty to house this family. They're clearly legally homeless. But the problem is that because Bedford didn't have anything which was tailored towards people with particular disabilities, we could force the council to accept a duty to house them, but then know that it's going to be very unpleasant because there won't be suitable accommodation available for them. So that's kind of like the thing which spawned this theme. So the question, I think I did an FOI first. I basically asked the question, give me the average waiting times for people on the housing register for those who do have a disability, like a mobility related disability, and those who don't have a disability. And what we found was, for 1, 2 and 3 bed properties, certainly 3 of the 4 property types, people would have to wait longer if they had a disability, if they're going through homelessness services, to actually get housed, which is clearly a breach of the Equality Act, I'd say. And there was also this kind of parallel issue where the council didn't have wheelchair accessible temporary accommodation available. So I think the first question we asked on the issue was, what does the council do if a wheelchair user comes and makes a homeless application and is owed the Section 188 duty? And effectively the answer was, we scramble around to try and find something, and they won't, that might not work, or it might work, it just depends what's there at the time. So that kind of got their attention, and then we kind of took these stats about the longer waiting times for people with disabilities, and we raised it a couple of times because they kind of tried to shrug it off a little bit. It's still an issue which has not been resolved entirely, but as far as I know, and I don't have the figures, but what I understand, the council's bought a number of wheelchair accessible temporary accommodation units. Now that doesn't deal with the long-term fact that there's not enough accessible housing out there, which is why disabled people have to wait longer to get housed. But that kind of sets up this process where, if you're working with the council for years, when it comes to the housing strategy, you can raise this as another issue. At the moment in Bedford, there's this local plan 2040, which is going to set out the strategy for the next 15 years. And you use these questions you've raised in previous committees about these waiting times being longer if you've got disability, to make the point that the council needs to ensure there's enough accessible housing. It's a really big issue, actually, because for developers, accessible housing is not as profitable because the footprints of the properties are bigger, because you need wider doors, you need often downstairs bathrooms, that sort of thing. And so they don't like building accessible housing, which, as I say, is why kind of leads to this lack of accessible housing, which is why the waiting times are longer. It does make me laugh, but it makes me annoyed when I saw it on Manchester City Council's website, where they said, due to too much demand, or words to this effect, due to too much demand, there's not enough accessible housing around. It's like, no, due to inadequate supply. It's not about there being too much demand. It's not that, you know, people are choosing to be disabled and kind of, you know, meaning that the council has to do more work. It's the fact that the council aren't specifically planning to ensure they have got enough accessible housing for their residents, and that's a very different thing from what Manchester were trying to make out. So I'm not sure I told you that, but it's just kind of, it's interesting to see how council mentality kind of comes out in their policies and their kind of publication stuff. So do keep an eye on that sort of thing. You know, anytime the council's saying that, you know, there's too much demand, it's not that. They've got inadequate supply. They haven't planned properly. It's their fault. It's not the homeless people's fault for kind of, you know, there not being enough houses. It's the council's fault for not building enough in the first place. So yeah, hopefully that's another video which is helpful. Hopefully it gives you these kind of template questions to ask a council and kind of ideas to pursue in your area. But I'm hoping you're beginning to see there's actually a lot of stuff you can ask that can have quite dramatic results actually with maybe an hour's work every quarter. So it's not time consuming stuff. It can be if you really love it, but you can just kind of do this bare minimum of sending a question in. You don't have to attend the meeting, you just get someone else to read it there. You can then read back what the answer is. Not all councils, but most councils seem to now video their committee meetings and put them on their website, so you can look back and see what the answer was and sort of see how the response was, and hopefully you'll be able to kind of start building up a bit of an you know, kind of group of you in your area who can take these questions and actually push for these changes over many years. It's not, yeah, don't think you're going to change the world in a month. You won't, but it takes time, but it works. It's worth it, is what I'd say, because even based on the questions we've asked, you know, there's clear evidence that hundreds of people every year will be better off because there's more housing officers, there's more accessible temporary accommodation, there's better training, you know, there's kind of more accountability, all of those kinds of things that's actually going to lead to an improvement in people's lives. So it's worth the effort, I'd say.